Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the third and final webinar, which we're running with IWFM and the SFMI, looking at Scope 3. And this one is particularly looking at developing a greenhouse gas roadmap and a target. What I'll do is I'll wait another 30 seconds or so for participants to join us, and then we'll crack on with the webinar. Yeah. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. We've still got some participants joining us, but I'll crack on with the webinar. For today, we're going to be running through the lessons learned that have come through from research projects which we've been undertaken as part of the SFMI Scope 3 framework developments. And we'll also have Skanska, who's one of our Tier 1 partners there, talking about their own net zero strategy and decarbonisation programme, which they've put in place, and some fantastic, not only global measures, but really practical activities that they've undertaken over the last few months and years. And then also involving and inviting Chloe to join us from IEMA, and particularly during the panel discussion at the end, to talk about IEMA's role as well, from taking a lead in the professional standard setting and the technical knowledge perspective. So the three speakers that we have, so myself, my name is Sunil Shah, I'm the Managing Director for Cloud Advisory, and I also lead on the SFMI program itself as well. 25 plus years working in the field of sustainability and the built environment, and within that a number of years with IWFM and also with government departments as well. We've also got Chloe Fiddy, who is the Policy and Engagement Lead for Climate and Energy at IEMA. And Chloe, she works with the CCE steering group to deliver a range of policy and practice guidance for IEMA members. She's previously worked for local governments in climate change and development planning policy, advising on the organisational and regional net zero transition. Chloe has also over a decade of experience in manufacturing sector, championing and implementing sustainable production methods. Lovely to have you, Chloe. And we also have Sharon Maynard, who's Head of Environment Building Services at Skanska UK. Sharon is Head of Environment and of the Building Services Operating Unit at Skanska. She's worked in the construction industry for the past 15 years and sits on the environmental leadership team. She's responsible for delivering the strategic environmental aspirations of the business through the building services team, who cover a diverse portfolio of facilities management, specialist mechanical and electrical contracts. Having worked on projects in the utility sector, major road schemes, as well as construction of schools, hospitals and offices, she has a wide range of experience with different clients and supply chains. Lovely to have you as well, Sharon. So if I start with a quick background in terms of the project itself and what we've been doing. So the Scope 3 emissions in FM research, we've had 4 Tier 1 companies that have supported us together with the likes of IEMA, IWFM and RSCS. And we're currently in stage 2 of the program, the 4-stage program. This has been to look at the framework that was developed and to test it out with real life data and real life organizational activities. And so what we're going to be doing today is 2 parts. One is an initial review of the data and the information that has come through. but also today marks the launch of the framework which has been developed off the back of this, which is looking at setting in place a standardized methodology and approach for how the FM sector can capture the carbon emissions from its services, but also then what we can start to do with that data in terms of delivery of services, but also potentially how we utilize that back in the front end of the design and the construction process, so we can deliver better buildings that are for the operations of those working within it. So in terms of the data that we're starting to get, this is some of the initial data sets that we're getting. And we've looked at the data from both what we call a top-down, which is an apportionment of the service contract by value, and also in terms of the total income from an organisation. And so looking at that top-down apportionment, where we literally take a proportion of the value of a contract versus the total turnover of company, we get a figure of the emissions for that contract activity. We've also looked at it from a bottom-up perspective, which is starting to capture the detailed activities that take place on site and starting to measure the actual emissions that are taking place from those individual activities. And so what we're starting to see is that sometimes those emissions are relatively close. So in this, for the B organisation, the difference between having a top-down approach and an apportioned level and also a bottom-up is relatively close. It's within 10% of each other. But what we've also started to see is sometimes where we have the top-down, which is the most commonly applied approach, if we have two organisations which gives a top-down value in a tender exercise that is relatively similar to each other, and this is based upon just the apportionment, when we look at it from a bottom-up perspective of the actual emissions, we see a massive difference between the two levels of the actual emissions which are being generated. So I think from what we're looking at here is an individual level and looking at the initial set of data that we've got, is there is a real difference between the top-down apportioned level and also the bottom-up approach, and therefore there's a real need to be able to capture that bottom-up data to have a much better understanding of the emissions, but also it then allows us to start to do something with the data itself. So this is an example of the emissions which have been generated for one of those contracts. And what we start to see here is the way that those emissions are broken down. We've captured them both in terms of the type of greenhouse gas emissions, captured as Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3. But we've also started to capture it in terms of the services that are being provided. So under areas such as the food preparation, cleaning activities, and so on. And what's noticeable in this example here is the significant levels that we have for both food preparation, but also in this case for the cleaning. And so if we start to look at where we want to tackle the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, it'll be within these two service lines that we'd start to look at first for where those reductions can be, simply because they are the largest areas of greenhouse gas emissions. So bringing that a bit further into some examples of the two projects, one is a school and one is an office, we start to capture data from the bottom up, where we're looking at the service line by service line generation of emissions and the proportion of those. And the two examples here gives two very different levels of emissions that are being generated from the typical activities that are coming through, but it talks very much about where you would then start to focus your attention on where the emissions are being generated, but also where they can be reduced. So this level of detail then allows a very different type of conversation to happen as well at procurement stage and contract setting stage, because it allows for a difference for how food preparation might take place in the school and the maintenance activities might take place, or within the office environment, again, how that maintenance and the management activities take place to be able to reduce those emissions. And the way that we break down the data can be quite detailed, and we can go into large amounts of drilling down into the individual areas to understand what the emissions levels are and emissions values are. But this kind of exercise also has taught us something else, which is when we do drill into this. So this graph here, the top 4 areas that are listed out here, and a lot of the emissions that are being generated are from non-standard activities. They're from reactive works, from project works, which may not be pre-planned. So we've got another challenge in terms of the way that the data comes through, and particularly for some of the M&E type services, the hard FM type services, where we do have significant amounts of reactive works. We now have a variable greenhouse gas emissions footprint that is being generated because it's based on also the number of projects that are taking place. So again, how that gets communicated and also how that influences the baseline calculations that you then put forward will also be a key factor in here. So these are the initial findings. We've got a bit more digging into the numbers to do over the following weeks, but I think out of this, we're then going to start to add some of this depth and the detail through into some of the reporting around some of the emissions factors for the services that are being generated, but also some guidance in terms of what we can do in the examples of reactive works and how we set those baselines. So for that, what does that mean in terms of creating a net zero roadmap? So first of all, it's about understanding the baseline and the emissions. So that includes if it's reactive works and you've got lots of project related activities, those also needs to be captured as well. It's about looking at and understanding what the future changes in the business is. So what's the growth projection? What is the business changes that are intended to take place in terms of the organisation, the way that it's going to operate from a real estate and also a country level service activity as well. And then it's also starting to look at the short-term, medium-term and long-term opportunities that exist. Short-term, typically less than 3 years, already planned in based upon low-cost, medium-cost activities and activities already within the project pipeline. And then it's moving towards areas which require budgets and larger scale changes. These might be in terms of capital changes, but also systemic changes within the organisation. How does this form part of the way that your finance is operating so that we capture the right data and we can start to model the data correctly? So this needs to form not just in terms of an FM approach, but also as part of the way that you procure your items and the way that the finances is structured around it. And finally, it's also to factor in some of the external changes. So grid is going to decarbonise, the electricity prices are going to remain high, potentially at double the rates that they were back in 2019. We are going to get more electric vehicles coming through and a reduction of combustion vehicles. So all of those are the external factors that will also have a play. So modelling of all of this within the programme helps you to understand what is going to happen. And from that, it allows you to understand what the gap is between what your programme is telling you based upon what's intended to happen and also where your target might be. And then that starts a conversation around where the gaps are and what you need to do to be able to close out those gaps. And then it's about regularly reviewing that roadmap. So as changes occur, as there's a better understanding of what's required, we then start to update the roadmap and start to talk about what else can be achieved. So some examples of what can go into a roadmap are listed out here. So they cover it's just the scope 3 areas that are listed in here. But we also start to look at what should and shouldn't be included. So certainly new build and refurbishments, the embodied carbon associated should be included. But Other areas such as, do we also include for travel by visitors and contractors into locations and how they're captured? Because again, there's a decision that's being made around how that gets included. So high locations with high numbers of visitors should be including those individuals in there. And it's also including the commuting and the home working activities as well, because those are also in direct relation to the services that are being provided. And again, other areas in here look at areas such as supply chain, which will become quite a significant area in how you work in partnership with them, but also from a grounds management perspective, how we can better utilize the land in terms of habitat restoration and the use of the space as a potential sequestration activity as well. So all of this comes together into a roadmap which takes you from a baseline figure, adds in areas such as, in this example here, where company vehicles have been removed and instead there's a payment paid to staff. So this comes in as their own paid for travel activities. So there's an uplift to these Scope 3 emissions. And we take that through a 10-year program and a timeline of the activities, the initiatives that are being implemented and delivered, which gives us an understanding as to where we're intending to be at the end of those 10 years. So this then provides you with that forward tracking, and then it's updated on an annual basis based upon where the company is and the changes that they've made as well to their organizational program. So a lot of what we've been doing is around how we capture the data, and certainly in this example for the roadmap, this allows us then, taking this whether it's from a company or whether it's from a service line in a contract level activity, allows us to be able to drill into the details, but talk about how we can then help customers and help organisations achieve the net zero targets which they're putting forward. Okay, so I'll hand over now to Sharon, who's going to talk about the decarbonisation programs and also Skanska's overall program and targets. Sharon?
Lovely, thanks, Sunil. So yeah, I'm going to just give a run through of our carbon journey so far, both across our UK business and with a bit more detail on our FM activities. But there are, I suppose, three significant changes or sort of evolutions that we've seen since we set our initial target that I think are worth sort of highlighting for anybody that's in the process of going through setting out their own roadmap and some lessons that we've learned. So if you want to click on, Sunil. So just a little bit of background. Skanska, we're a multidisciplinary contractor operating globally. In the UK, our turnover is around 1.2 billion. And we are divided up into several different operating units, the largest of which is our building services operating unit, both by revenue and also by the number of staff that we have. So a big chunk of our overall business, it sits within work that we do with MEP and FM. However, when we started looking at our carbon impact, the two don't necessarily go together in terms of the highest revenue having the highest carbon impact, and that's a lot to do with just the type of materials that we use in other parts of our business, high intensity around concrete and steel. So that has shaped our view on how we go about approaching our reduction targets. So if you click onto the next slide. So our first target we put out in 2019, and this was for us to be a net zero carbon business across all scopes by 2045. Because we were quite early in terms of setting a target in the industry, we were quite keen to ensure that we were basing our predictions on data that we had, and that was largely spend and attributing and matching carbon with the spend. So we looked at 8 years worth of information back through our business in terms of what we'd bought from a materials perspective, our fleet, to try and document a sort of strategic and repeatable approach to how we were measuring our our carbon. We were adamant at that point that we would include our scope 3, because when we looked at our numbers, it was about 10 times as much as of a carbon impact when we included our scope 3, so it didn't seem right that we wouldn't include those. And I'll talk a little bit later about how that sort of has evolved as time has gone by and more people are now on board with having net zero carbon targets themselves. So it wasn't a perfect science a couple of years ago when we were looking at acquiring this data, but it was documented in a way that it was repeatable, and so we would be able to do comparisons year on year, and as our data improved, we would be able to apply that to any changes in terms of our overall carbon impact. So if you want to click forward. So the key elements of any type of carbon roadmap or approach, I think, are that there are a zero date. So ours is zero emissions by 2045. That is based in reality and aligned with the industries from which we procure most of our materials. So we looked at carbon and steel industries, looked at when they were going to decarbonise, when the grid was looking to decarbonise, and setting our stall out in line with that, because the gap would just be too wide if we were looking to go and be zero carbon a long time ahead of those. So I think it's important to look at your supply chain and to set targets that are based in reality on what the people that you are using to provide the services that you deliver are doing. An interim target, so having some kind of check sooner rather than later about where you are in terms of your reduction aspirations, and then obviously an intensity figure, because revenue may well go up and down, but we want to be able to show that per £1,000,000 of revenue, our intensity, the amount of carbon that we're emitting, reduces. And then all of that is wrapped up and ratified via the Science Based Targets Initiative. And again, that kind of external benchmark, I think, has been really key in helping our clients understand that our target is sort of realistic and achievable. So the evolution from that was developing a communicatable roadmap, and the sort of the checkpoints or the 6 areas on that slide won't really be a surprise to anybody in terms of areas that you look at when you're reducing your carbon impact. But there were steps, behind each of those areas about what would be a short, medium, and long-term aspiration. And it's interesting looking back now at some of our aspirations, how some things have gone much, much quicker. Some things have not gone quite as quickly as we thought. And I think that's something to bear in mind when anybody is looking at putting together a roadmap there. It's hard to, our crystal balls aren't always 100% accurate. And so there's going to be places where you see sort of more significant change than you expect, and then others that go a bit slower. But what I will say is that this was kind of the first point, the first sort of significant change or evolution in carbon in our business, insofar as this roadmap belonged to the sustainability team, and it was put together, and all of the information in it and all of the aspirations were from the sustainability team. And the next step after this, if you click onto the next slide, Sunil, shows the change that happened when those focus areas might be quite similar, but the difference was this was when our business took our carbon roadmap and put it into our business plan alongside our aspirations for delivering for our customers, our financial requirements, our aspirations around digital productivity, those sort of elements. And carbon has become an area of focus for the whole business, and that has really sort of supercharged our progress, I think. One thing that is significantly different in these 6 focus areas to on the previous slide was the addition of training, and it's something that I'll come back to again and again, because that is where our CEO at the time sort of wanted us to metaphorically hand over the baton of carbon, for it to go from being within the remit of the environmental sustainability team and to be something that the whole business needed to be involved in, and that required a significant training program. So the last 2 years of our roadmap has been with a huge focus on training. So if you go on to the next slide, Sunil. So the other thing with those 6 focus areas is that because we've got different operating units in our business, there are going to be more or less emphasis on each of those 6 areas, with the exception of training, which is high emphasis across all of the operating units. So for us in FM, from the work that we do, our fleet was a key area of impact. We had the biggest fleet out of the whole business, and so we had to look at sort of speeding up what we were doing there, and we set a target of a net zero fleet by 2027. And then data and tools was key, because when we had our initial net zero by 2045 target, when you get down into the FM spend, it gets quite complicated and quite diverse quite quickly, as I'm sure lots of people on the call will understand. And so we needed to start to develop our detailed knowledge in our specific part of the business, not least because it was such a high revenue part of the business, but also because we know that the spotlight will swing round, and the information that's required from people who are maintaining buildings all day, every day of the year is going to be significant going forward. So those are the areas we're targeting from an FM perspective. The next slide just shows, I suppose, the second significant change in the evolution of our roadmap. And this is where this year we have decided to roll out across the entire business a carbon management system. So this goes from when we are pursuing and bidding work to when we hand over work. And really we need this because we've got so many different aspects happening across so many different elements, lots of focus areas, lots of training, etc. And you need, I think, a linear process or an end-to-end process that allows people to hang all these different pieces of information off, to understand if they're a commercial manager, this is their bit. If they're a design manager, this is their bit. And so we're rolling that out across 5 of our FM contracts this year, with a view that our programme keeps rolling then for any new contracts going into next year. So that's kind of the second sort of big evolution, I think, in our plan. So if you click onto the next slide, I think it was important to just touch on some practical tools and things that actually, once you've got your data, you've sort of looked at where you need to focus, what do you actually then do next? And so the programme, if you click on Sunil, the programme that we've been working with SFMI and our other partners in this activity has just been really instrumental, I think, in heightening the knowledge, I think, of some of our senior leaders to understand that this is an industry that in order to move forward, coming together is really helpful to compare data. And this has been significant, I think, in raising up the agenda, the challenges of recording carbon and specific data in Scope 3 and FM. But I think is really important to show that when we work across industry on a common problem, we end up with the sort of data that Sunil showed earlier that shows that, you know, when you compare across different contractors and across different levels, your results can be different. And so we have to find a way and navigate a way through that to come up with a really meaningful answer. So that's one sort of activity. And then I suppose the sort of the third big shift in our carbon journey is the fact that we've gone from it being carbon being within the remit of the sustainability team to being opened up to the business, but we're also finding that we're bringing in other specialists. So the digital element of how we get better data and therefore intervene in the most appropriate way to reduce carbon has been really significant. So smart building platforms where information about interventions in terms of planned maintenance or reactive maintenance to pieces of kit via the Internet of Things and sensors is something that our digital team have been looking at, and we believe in the future will help us have some more robust information, but also just make interventions in a way that reduce carbon in terms of trips to site, the type of equipment that we replace things with, etc. And then if you click on again, Sunil, another element that we've been looking at that our digital team our championing is through mobile solutions. So this is when we are, engineers are out on site. How are we going to collect real-time information from them? So when Sunil talked about top-down and bottom-up approach, this is sort of the bottom-up element to understand better what material they're using, how much the labour versus just the engineers' know-how is split versus against materials. So understanding how we're operating out in the field is really important, and that's something that our CAFM team are championing. So again, something that's beyond perhaps the remit of the environment team. And just while we're getting the slides back up, the very last slide that I wanted to show is just a couple of weeks ago. We won an award where a piece of software was actually to look at the reuse of steel in buildings and how we can draw on information across the industry to reuse steel. Won an award at the Digital Construction Awards. And the reason I highlight it is just because that was almost solely driven by our BIM experts and our digital team, with the support from our perspective from a carbon viewpoint, but really has been driven by their expertise in terms of digitalising our approach to carbon. So how are we getting on in terms of results? So we publish our results as a business. You can probably click onto the last slide there, Sunil. Yeah, next one, and one more. We are driving down carbon. We've made some significant inroads when we're looking across our entire business. The report is published. On the right hand side there are the graphs with the breakdowns between all the different types of materials we use, our scope 1, 2 and 3. And again, this is measured in the same way that we measured our first emissions, but with greater granularity of detail. And I suppose the last thing I would say is that our net zero carbon by 2045 is obviously what we're aiming for. But what we're finding more and more is that it's our clients' targets that are also of paramount importance. And obviously the work we do will feed into those. But the overlap now between the data that belongs to clients or belongs to us, or whose scope 1 or whose scope 3 it is a conversation that's really sort of evolving and developing. And it's quite interesting how the data is now cut and carved, and how, the question is less about what our target is and maybe more about how we're going to help our clients with their target. And that's something that being flexible in terms of the digital solutions and our data is important to support that. So we're hoping that we continue on our downward trajectory, and yeah, we'll keep you posted on any future developments. But that's the end of my slides for now. Yeah. So now.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Sharon. It's a really great presentation, and the journey that you've been on and the steps that you've taken, I think are great. So, I mean, the quick notes which I've got is almost as those 4 steps. The first one is just collating together that 2019 report that you produced, highlighted what you knew, but also what you didn't know. And so it allowed you to then start to progress and move on from a position where everyone understood where you wanted to get to. The second part is then setting out the roadmap, which then captured a lot of what you're trying to achieve in some simple steps, which allows for communication across the business and engagement across the whole value chain. And then that became reality when we started to look at embedding it into the business plan. And then the final stage, which is the one that you're in now, is where you're looking at it at the contract level. So you spoke about the carbon management system, the digital teams and so on, and then how you use it to start that engagement with customers and a different form of conversation, then allows us to go into your targets are also your customers' targets, which are also the planetary targets. And actually all 3 of them can be met together, but it requires a conversation for that to happen.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Fantastic, thank you. If I can get technology working as well, there's a few gremlins in here as well today. So if I can hand over to Chloe Fiddy from IEMA.
Yep. Hi. Thanks, Sunil. So thanks very much for having me in this webinar. Just a very brief introduction to IEMA, which is the Institute of Environmental Management and Assessment, which is not very snappy, which is why we call it IEMA. As you can see on the slide, we're the membership body for environment and sustainability professionals. So our profile is around the globe. We've got around 21,000 individual members from the widest possible range of sectors. The common thread being that everyone who is a member is in a role of some sort delivering on sustainability, either for their own organisation or for their clients. We have around 300 corporate partners. So our corporate partners include government departments, non-departmental government bodies, for instance, the NHS, the Treasury. We have large corporate firms, whole trade bodies, and we also have a large number of SMEs within our corporate membership. So the core purpose of IEMA is to support the performance of all our members. So we aim to drive the improvement of all of the work that's being carried out in our sector. And it's obviously, as everyone on this call will know, it's a very rapidly moving sector. So things change quite a lot, and something that was up to date last year is now not up to date, and we have to revise our advice or our guidance. So the activities that we do at IEMA, so we provide our members with the resources that they need to make sure that they're working with the latest information and toolkits. Our members have access to a reading room, which has a wide range of data and resources on good practice. We share knowledge and insight. So when we produce resources, they're produced via our subject area steering group. So I look after the climate change and energy steering group. We also have a steering group for circular economy, sustainable finance, biodiversity and natural capital. So the steering groups are drawn from the membership, and they sort of look to identify gaps in knowledge and then put together guidance and advice to share with wider membership. And I'll talk a little bit in a second about something that we're working on for transition planning. And then just very briefly, we have sort of community and networking opportunities for our members with regional networks, but also sort of fairly informally as well, where people email us and we're able to sort of pass people on to other people and make contacts. And then on the formal side, we do offer training and qualifications. So for people at different stages of their careers, ranging from one-day introduction courses to fully fledged university courses that are mapped to our graduate membership standard. So some courses are designed to upskill staff just to be more aware of sustainability issues, as the sorts of things Sharon was talking about, where they did a whole program to upskill the entire workforce rather than just sort of everything sitting with sustainability. And then other courses are sort of springboards for professional careers. And then we do offer a route to chartered membership. So we are licensed by the Society for the Environment to award chartered environmentalist and chartered environmental practitioner status to applicants who meet those criteria, which of course gives a real boost to careers. So one of the things, so we were invited to be participants, observer participants in the project that's currently in front of you, which is very exciting. So we are on the board looking at it as a sort of example to see how it's going. Scope 3 is a super difficult topic, and it's really exciting to see a group of organisations come together in the facilities management sector and really start to address the issues that are specifically faced by facilities management. So IEMA was invited to join the board and be observers and throw in advice where we see that we can, but also share the learning as well with our members, because there's an awful lot that's going on that's really come out of this project. Something that we've been working on very recently is a project on transition planning guidance directly aimed at SMEs. So that won't target specifically SMEs within the facilities management sector, but all SMEs. And how we've started going about that, that background research was we held workshops with a number of members, and also a number of members of Pledge to Net Zero, which is an organisation, an initiative that we've signed up to, and looked at common barriers to designing transition plans, to engaging with their supply chain networks, and specifically scope 3 always comes up as the biggest problem of all. And so we've, through those workshops and conversations, we've drawn up a big list of barriers and problems that SMEs are facing, and we're currently in the process of writing some guidance on overcoming those barriers, and we're looking at sharing good practice from our membership where things are working well as part of that guidance. That will be published in probably sort of September time. So this is something that we are looking at IEMA as well. So there's a lot of synergies between what we're doing and this project here. So thanks for having me on the panel. I think that's a gallop of an introduction on IEMA, which is probably as much as you needed to know. If there are any questions now, I can take them, or I can wait for the panel questions.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Chloe. And to close measure, if you've got any questions, do please enter them into the Q&A function as well. And as Chloe, you've mentioned, that there's an awful lot of SMEs that are involved in the supply chain side of FM providers. So whilst you might have larger FM organisations involved in delivering like ScanScore use an awful lot of SMEs. And so actually that's one of the key challenges. How do we capture that data, and how do we provide that advice and guidance so that SMEs don't feel that they're doing it on their own, they've got support and guidance and help, but it also doesn't become a burden that there's 20 different companies asking them to do it in a slightly different way each time. So having that consistency is, again, is a key part. So thank you for raising that. So we've started to get some questions coming through, so please do continue. I'm going to take Chair's privilege as well and ask the first question. So the question for both of you is, given that Scope 3 is such a significant part of any company's emissions, yet somewhere in between from 75 to 90% of those emissions, how important is it to have a clear understanding of the emissions on day one in order to be able to set that decarbonisation plan and that forward trajectory? Sharon, if I can come to you first.
Yeah, I think that with anything where you're trying to, engender significant change, which requires people to be on board, what you need is to be focused on something where you're going to get some return and some visible impact. And I think that having data like the data that you showed at the beginning, which showed perhaps not unexpectedly in some areas that, being high impact from a carbon perspective, but perhaps, for example, cleaning, would we have considered that would have been a significant area from a carbon perspective? So I think having the best data that you can just allows you to make the best interventions, which shows people then progress, and that these efforts that they're making do have a return. So I think that without, I think the data has really improved. I think that the way data is collected in general has improved. The way it can be cut and carved is better. I think the challenge is how you then corral that data into something that gives you direction to make the right sort of interventions and show people that, progress can be made, which then justifies, potential spend or the time investment that's required. So I think that, the more data that you have and the better it shows you where to target your efforts, the easier life can be and your roadmap can sort of progress.
Yeah, fantastic. And Chloe?
Yeah, so yes, I would agree with all of that and add to it. It's a really, really difficult question because you want to get started, but you need the data. And so I think what we would say is really go for it and do the best you can to get your data, but don't let waiting for the perfect data hold you back on getting started. So if you can find something to go with now, go with it now. There'll always be some low regret, low hanging fruit options while you're gathering everything else. And then the other thing that comes up a lot for us, our members often talk to us about, is it can be really demoralizing, because in fact, once your emissions look as though they're going up, because sometimes the more data you're getting, the more you go into, the more you're adding, you think, right, we've conquered these categories, we've gone with these most obvious scope 3 categories, we've conquered these, let's start measuring this one, let's work our way along through. And then all of a sudden it sort of goes up. And we have some of our we've had conversations where people say to us, how are we supposed to tell the board this? The board hired us to bring down emissions. How can we go back to them this year and say our emissions have gone up? Actually, it means you've got better at your job, and you're actually measuring things better. And so preparing yourself for that conversation and sort of demonstrating that actually the more you know, the more you can do, which goes back to exactly Sharon's point, that the more you work on getting it right, the more you'll succeed at it.
Sharon, I just want to bring you, because I saw you nodding and smiling at the point where Chloe's mentioned about emissions going up and needing to explain. Can you just talk through your own experience on that?
Yeah, so when our team was doing the initial measure in 2019, they are not the kind of people who want to be making extrapolations of estimates, that they want the exact data, and they live in fear of this very question where, hold on, now your measurement is gone up. And that's why I think we were very particular to sort of have a documented approach, so that if under challenge, you're able to say, if I just repeat that exact approach, warts and all, this is the actual number that I would come up with. However, we now know more information, better information. So, this is our number at the moment, but having that methodology to always be able to come back and compare like with like can be helpful. And that's helpful internally and also with clients, because when you're looking at very short periods of time to get over quite complex information, those can be killer blows, when suddenly the number is increased. And so it's being sort of smart in how you sort of setting out your approach, and as Chloe said, highlighting that you can't unknow stuff. Now that we've lifted up this stone and it's got a whole heap of carbon underneath it, we can't put it back down again, so that's the right thing, and that is progress, but yeah, challenging in the short term.
Yeah, and so I guess it's just about knowing that almost certainly you will have those difficult conversations with the board, but having the robustness of a methodology that you followed, and you're able to talk about why things have changed over time, does give confidence to the board that you're going down the right path, that things are being done correctly, but also that it may change again. Numbers may go down as well. Sound like a for banking sector now, but they may go down as well, and that's going to be a positive from the organisation. So we've got a slew of questions which are starting to come through from Zubair, looking at how are these bodies functioning in the Middle East. So certainly I can talk about from RSCS and the IWFM perspective. Both got bodies that operate out in the Middle East. For the work that we're doing, we're intending this piece of work to be a global standard and a global framework that will operate. So from Middle East and also anywhere else that the Americas, we're intending for this standard to apply across all the FM functions. And I'll come on a bit later on about the consultation, but also about the next stage as well. And Chloe, I don't know if you want to talk very quickly about your IMA within the Middle East.
Yes, so we have members in the Middle East, and we are specifically we're building up our membership around the globe, because obviously there are so many overlaps between and good knowledge sharing that can be done cross borders. So yes, I don't have any actual numbers off the top of my head, but we do have membership in the Middle East. So
Thank you. Question from Jerry for Sharon. What training does Skanska roll out to their employees to get their engagements?
Yeah, so the program of training last year was for all senior leaders in the business. So this is our president down through our executive management team and all of the operating unit leadership teams. They had a specific training program that was written internally and delivered by our internal team. So our head of environment technical and our central carbon manager. And those programs were bespoke to the type of work that each operating unit did. So we weren't rolling out the same training, talking about carbon and steel to our FM leadership team, you know, and vice versa. We were looking at the specific challenges within each operating unit. And then the next tranche was for senior commercial design and procurement teams. So they all had a specific program written for each of those disciplines to talk about what their interventions would be. And this year, the programs are targeted at our project director or contract manager or general manager level. And those are 2-hour sessions that I will deliver to our sort of 75 top contract managers and project directors, looking at what are the things that they are seeing daily with their clients. So a much less corporate program, a much more sort of coaching session where they are allowed to ask the questions that perhaps they think they should know the answer to already, because it's just sort of a one-to-one or a small group environment. And we've also then got a similar sort of coaching situation with our procurement team. And we've done one session where we've invited our supply chain in, and there's another session happening later on this year where we'll bring more of our supply chain in to, again, have a frank conversation about, this is the data we're going to need from you. What is standing in your way of giving it to us? How can we help you with that? We really don't want you to have this same conversation with 5 other tier 1 contractors and a different form to be filled out. So how can we get around that? So it's kind of like a step by step. And then, you know, we do have kind of toolbox talk CPD sessions on equipment for our engineers and our technical specialists. And so hopefully we're covering quite a, you know, most people sort of in the business one way or another, but in different ways that suits them better.
Fantastic. And yes, I mean, I think, as you say, it's about how do you fit it into the culture of how they do their business, but also a forum to allow those what will deem to be silly questions to be asked, and say, look, everyone else is thinking it. Yeah, it's fine.
Yeah, absolutely.
Question.
Yeah, and to be honest with you, the environment team and my team learn as much from those sessions as the other way around, because we're hearing things where, you know, yes, I know this is a big thing on the agenda, but really it causes us a problem because when we're rolling it out, X, Y, and Z happens. So, you know, it's useful when training becomes more sort of a coaching session for both parties involved, I think.
Yeah, fantastic. Got a quick question for Tim, just conscious of time. About use of carbon intensity within science-based targets, target setting. Tim, yes, you can use carbon intensity. There's a number of measures that you can use to be able to set your forward targets. Some are absolute measures, some are based upon engagement targets, and some of them are also intensity level targets. So depending upon which sector that you're talking about and looking at, there's a variety of different ways of how you can put forward those targets themselves. Sharon, don't know if you want to add a bit more from Skanska's the way that
only to say that the intensity figure was just so crucial when our revenue has the potential to be quite volatile depending on any big infrastructure job that comes out from a government perspective they weren't expecting. And so yeah, it's very helpful.
Fantastic. So just to mention about the consultation which has taken place. So That will be going out later today onto our website. It's a closed form, so there's a link that we're going to send out, and I think that will be sent out as part of the link to this training, this webinar session. So that will be done, I believe, on Thursday. What I would encourage is do have a look at the framework documents. We do have a series of consultation questions which we'd like to ask you to get some feedback, and that feedback is about how do we improve the framework, the level of detail which is in there, if you need more examples that are being provided, more explanations, etc. That allows us over the next few months to add some further depth and to fine-tune the document. The intention is then this framework then becomes the standard globally for how we start to look at Scope 3 emissions measurement for the FM sector. It's then going to take us into stage 3 of the work, which is likely to take place winter of this year. And the intention for phase 3 is to look to collect data from between 150 and 200 contract level activities globally. The intention there is to not only be able to develop the tools to enable that to happen, but to also start to develop emissions factors and to understand about performance of FM and the carbon emissions that are generated, and then to be able to utilize that knowledge in the way that was spoken about today in terms of conversations with customers and conversations through the life cycle of things as well. So that third stage will be quite crucial to help us to collect that data and that information. And at the end of that third phase, we'll also have a further updated version of the framework with the knowledge that we've captured during the stage, and that gets fed into the further framework itself. Currently, the framework is directly linked to the RICS whole life carbon tool, which is undergoing a revamp at the minute. So you can currently use the framework to capture the data and then feed into the RICS whole life carbon reporting system, which they do have. So we've already started the mechanisms of building this into the buildings program itself. Okay, further details then if you want to have a look at some of the SFMI activities and to look at some further guidance and information about Scope 3 and others about SFMI is listed on here as well. But I'd like to say thank you very much to both Chloe and Sharon for your wise words and great insights as well into looking at Scope 3 and great advice. Thank you very much, everyone, and have a lovely rest of your day.
Thank you.